Hello everyone, my name is Jeremy Boutros and I am a victim of Shawn Bolz. And I've got some notes here. I'm going to go through my process. I was largely impacted by Mike Winger's video. I guess in a way he quoted me from a friend of mine that maybe mentioned a few things. I'm going to go through my process. This might be a long video or might be a few different videos, I'm not sure. I want to be able to share the truth about what took place from my perspective. I worked for Shawn for 7 years or more, maybe 7 or 8 years. And I also went to BSSM. I went to Bethel school and I interned for Pastor Bill. And I also spent 2 years with Bob Hartley in Kansas City. So I guess in that way I'm uniquely qualified to speak about who they are, what they're about. I believe I'm the only one who's actually traveled with everybody there around the world. So I'll go through my process today. I've processed this internally a lot. Try to be as efficient as possible. Feel free to speed the video up if necessary. Mike Winger's video prompted my video today because I had a bunch of reach outs. I got a bunch of people that had known me in the past that were asking questions, asking my perspective, and I felt like it was really helpful. And there's so much misinformation and lack of clarity that's out there right now, confusion on different things that I felt like I could help clarify things and help those out that might have been victimized as well. My background, I'm going to start with my chronological background a little bit. It'll help you. I think you just can skip through it if you want a little bit. But I essentially feel like I was born Christian. It's kind of funny. My mom took me to a handful of missions trips, and one of the mission trips I went on was with Randy Clark and Bill Johnson in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And it was a youth power invasion trip. And it was the first time I ever heard Bill in person. And I listened to him and was so impacted by what he said. I felt like this is what I want to give my life to. I felt like God came upon me and blessed me and stayed with me after that trip in very unique ways. Somebody also prayed over me in the meeting, said that I would write 50 books before I'm 50. And I was only a teen at that point. That stayed with me, and I carried that. I was so impacted by that trip. I went back and decided I wanted to go to Bethel. I wanted to go to Bethel School of Ministry. And so I did. I left in the middle of the night. My dad wasn't really for it because he didn't understand it. It wasn't practical. It wasn't linear. Hey Pepper, can you sit down? Come here, come on. Sit down. Here you go. So I left in the middle of the night. I drove to Bethel. My dad wasn't really for it. He didn't really understand it. But I felt called to go. And even my pastor in Kansas City, the church I went to, thought I shouldn't go. I'm like, this is a ministry school. I've never heard of such a thing. Like, how could you be against Jesus? It was obviously a non-denominational Christian church. They were just scared about what might go wrong rather than what might go right. So I went to Bethel and I thoroughly enjoyed my time there. It was a smaller group of people in terms of the school. I think I was year number 6 or 7, not sure exactly, but it was a smaller group, and I got to know the leaders well, because smaller group, you get more interactions. Got to connect with Bill and Chris and Danny and Dan Fairley and all the others, in different prayer times or before or after service or at school. And then, I felt led by God, and I had a dream. And going into year number 3, some people don't make it to an internship year, or year number 3. And I had a dream, and I shared the dream with Bill's assistant. I felt like it pertained to them and pertained to Bill. And he shared it. They shared it to him, and I ended up becoming the first intern for Pastor Bill. And so, supernaturally, I think, God provided. Without a job, I quit my job so I could travel the world for a year. And I received, provision. Money came in from all various places. I never told anybody I needed money, but checks were coming in with the exact amounts of my trips coming up. It was incredible. And I never told anybody I needed money for anything. It was month by month, and I was able to go on every trip, and I was able to travel with Bill, and I was able to meet with him weekly and connect with him while we're traveling and back at home at the coffee shop, and had extra meetings with him, and it was such the sweetest time. It was just the most beautiful time. I had absolutely most incredible experience with Pastor Bill and Benny. I mean, she would sneak me, little fruit roll-ups in the meetings, when we were traveling internationally, and she'd always be passing me food, some healthy bar that she found or something. And with Bill, he was always so kind and generous and so freeing of his time for me. I felt like you could be with anybody in the world, like you're one of the leaders of the charismatic movement right now, and you're spending time with me. Like, I'd be in awe. I just felt so blessed and so thankful, and I'd ask him questions all the time, and I'd watch him work, and he was driven, and he pursues the finished work of Christ for today. And where many denominations, are settling on, religious routine, Pastor Bill, pursues what the Bible says in terms of an invitation for us today, and is willing to, explore what that looks like, whether, it's polished or not, but he's open to it. And I always remember he told me, stay hidden as long as possible. And I did. And, one time I was getting coffee at the coffee shop. I decided to come early because I was excited to meet with him. And I bought my own coffee, and he said, please never do that again. I want to bless you. I want to buy your coffee. And I felt so like I broke his heart, something so simple, but he really truly wanted to pour into me, and he did. And I remember times where I'm like walking. I was walking without a car at one point with my bag, I think from school or the airport or something. And he drove by. He stopped and did a U-turn, turned his car around to see if I needed anything. Because he was on his way to the airport. He was going to be late for a conference with several thousand people, and he was stopping to check up on me and see if I was okay and if I needed anything. And I just felt so blessed for that time. I felt like it was so special. He was so generous, not only to me, but he'd walk into the most expensive restaurants in Reading, and whether he'd eat there or not, he'd pay for everybody sitting down, and then he'd leave to bless them. And I could go on and on and on about how generous of an individual he was, and with Benny, and how amazing they were to me. I've never met anybody like Bill, Benny, and they're so Christ-like, so kind, and I have a soft heart for Bill, because he's gracious, and he's merciful, but he's also he pursues God's heart, even if it looks messy. When the oxen are gone, the manger's clean. And he's open to having a mess, because he knows work is happening, the kingdom is happening, and he knows the wheat and the tares grow together, and so he's very accepting of everybody, which most people aren't. And I remember an example, I think he shared it in his sermon, maybe he shared it with me personally, I can't remember exactly, but he was talking about a 12-year-old boy who was worshiping and manifesting, and he said, we can't tell if they're telling the truth or not, if it's true, if it's from God, but if I shut that down, then I might be shutting down a percentage of what God is doing in that one's life. So even if 90% of it's wrong or 95% of it's wrong, maybe the 5% is okay, and we'll let it happen. And it's just some form of worship or the manifestation of something. And it's such an interesting perspective. Like, if God's involved at all, like, should it permit? And I know, just the last thought here on Bill before I continue, I know that he allows people to speak at Bethel, and he brought people in all the time at school that he disagreed with, so we could get an open mind, different perspectives about things. And several people I heard that I disagreed with personally, and then I knew they would disagree with Pastor Bill and things, but one person spoke 90 minutes, and 88 minutes or 89 minutes of what they said I disagreed with the entire thing. And then Bill gets up at the end, and I'm thinking he's gonna light this guy on fire, like this guy's getting torched. And he says, you know what I love about this person? He said they're so good to their family, they're good to their wife, and they treat their kids really well. And we're so glad they were able to come here, and we were so glad they love their family. And he found the one thing that he could agree with, and then he obviously didn't talk about the other stuff, which we all wanted him to talk about. He never did. And so he has a different perspective, and the Bethel MO was very different too. You got 6 people roughly, executive team, maybe more or less, sharing different responsibilities, and they're all doing different things. Not one person in charge. There's no one necessarily hierarchy for everything. They divide and conquer, and they like it that way. These are the bunch from Weaverville. And they pursued the dream that was in Bill's father's heart, and then Bill's heart, and collectively all of their hearts, Chris and Danny and Dan and the others, Steve that came over, and they're just pursuing God, and it's not perfect, but my time at Bethel was very good, and I loved it. I did. I really loved it. Now, so it came to an end. I just basically finished my internship. It was incredible, and I didn't really have anywhere to go. Like, I didn't want to be a revival pastor. I wasn't a pastor. I'm not a pastor. But I was writing books at the time for myself, for other people, and I wanted to, do more ministry stuff. But Reading's small, so most people get sent back home, on their own, or they get sent out in the world. So I went back home in Kansas City, and I knew this girl named Amy Ann from Reading, and I followed her back there in terms of connection. And she introduced me to her dad, and introduced me to her dad's business. And I met John Swart, who was incredible. Worked with Bob Hartley, and in South Kansas City, where I ended up working for Bob for maybe a year and a half, 2 years. Initially, I pitched the proposal for work there because I really wanted to see what God wanted to do in my life and with ministry. So I was open, and I said, I'll create resources and it'll replace my income quickly. And I did that. I was able to make a bunch of resources for Bob, ghostwrite books and publish books and make CDs and stuff back when CDs are there. And I mainly, did that, kind of put my head down and, help set up the, product stuff, and tried to do some of the event stuff. Now, Bob's process, I'm going to jump into that for a minute here. Bob was a former wrestler, kind of someone who followed Mike Bickle. Although he wouldn't say it necessarily, he followed Mike Bickle around. He owned a lot of Mike Bickle's buildings and had a big business thing. And I enjoyed seeing the business side of things. But, they fought after the same girl, essentially. And, Bob says that he won her, And Bob had several fissures in his life, 5 predominant ones that he talked about. And those were apparent in everything that he did. Very wounded individual, but simultaneous to that, he's very gifted in his drivenness. He'd have dreams that were just incredible, and share stories that were just incredible in terms of content. I just love the content piece and the revelatory stuff. But the character side of things was difficult. He was a bachelor, guy at most, and he'd pretend like, he'd steamroll anybody. I remember one of the first times I was there, having a conversation with me, and he pulled me into the bathroom. While he continues the conversation, he shoved me into the shower, and while he's going to the restroom, I'm behind the curtain, and he's forcing me to listen to him while he's going to the bathroom. And that's the kind of guy Bob was. And it wasn't that he didn't have a filter, it's that he felt like the ideas in his mind were so important, way more important than anyone else's. And it was willing to run over everybody, and then realized later that he destroyed the relationship in the middle of his mission. And I think the thing that drove him the most, besides the fissures and the failures, the rejection, and the others that he carried, the woundedness, was the desperate need for him to be as successful as Mike Bickle. And Mike was very successful around him in terms of audience and growth, and so it drove him nuts. Literally drove him nuts. He would act erratic and try to read his notebooks and get in car accidents, and he got to the point where he was sleeping 45 minutes a night and drinking 5-hour energy drinks to just keep his eyelids open, and he's crashing, his livers are failing, his body's failing, and he's going to rehabs and stuff, and we had a, I guess it was conflicting in terms of the work relationship, for sure. Like, he'd call me at like 2 or 3 in the morning and ramble on about something you couldn't understand what he's saying, and it was gibberish. I know he had a bunch of notebooks, and he was copying words online, and I found that out later. When you're working there and you're in the middle of it, you don't know what's going on there. Like, I worked downstairs. I didn't see him take notes. I wasn't his assistant, but they would take notes for him and do all that, and very destructive patterns. And but the thing that keeps you there and you don't leave right away is he makes you invested. He makes you emotionally invested. and he keeps you roped in. He finds enough that he can work off of to keep you invested, and then he asks for a little, and then he asks for a little bit more, and then he asks for a little bit more until he gobbles you up, and it's very destructive, very unhealthy. But I stayed working there because John Swart was so great. He was incredible. I think he ran an architectural firm at one point. I loved working with him, and there were other people there that were really great too. But Bob was very destructive. But I was just trying to serve God, and so I stayed until I had a dream where I won't share my dream, but I stayed until I had a dream that it was time to go. And so I went on a trip, and I had a transition, beautiful transition. I felt like God was in it. And I started working for Johnny Enlow, and he was out of Atlanta. And I worked with Johnny Enlow for a couple of years, I think. And then he ended up taking me to LA. They moved to LA, and that was a beautiful transition. It was a great experience. I enjoyed that. He was very supportive. It was a good transition with Johnny. And then I spent a couple years kind of taking time off with ministry and worked at a learning behavioral center. And then I wanted to get back into it because I had deep down inside me, I wanted to write books, and I wanted to speak, and I wanted to lead people and help people in the way that I felt like I wanted to initially. And so I kind of looked at the closest proximity thing that I could find to, Bethel, and it was Expression 58, and Shawn was there at the Expression 58. And so I met with Shawn. I said, I'd like to get into this. I'd like to be a pastor of some kind, not really pastoring people, but more to itinerant and speaking and lead people and teach. I'm a good teacher, and I wanted to get into that. But I was open to serving if he could help make that happen, and I would serve him and work with him and on his stuff if he, helped me make my stuff happen. And he promised to do so. And so I was willing to take a pay cut, drop the thing, and start working with him part-time. So I did, and initially it was just a couple hours a week, and I spent, my time in a 6 square foot room, a little closet, or 10 square feet, doing products and selling products. And it was when Shawn had 14,000 Facebook followers, and I basically started every department for him, resources and events and partnerships and e-courses and TV shows and podcasts. I started all of it. I built it all from scratch. I was his assistant initially, and I traveled with him. And initially, his attitude and demeanor kind of came along the lines of what I was experiencing with Bob Hartley in Kansas City, and some of the Kansas City guys. Very bachelor pad kind of, locker room stuff, very crude jokes, sexual jokes, crude humor, sometimes racist, weird stuff with anime. And he was obsessed with video games, obsessed. Like, he'd spend 60% of his time playing video games. He'd have multiple consoles with him at any given time, and all various kinds of video games, Shawn was much like Mike Bickle. Shawn, really studied people, and he knew how to manipulate people. And I'm not just saying that flippantly, but he really truly studied people, and how to win people over, and how to motivate them and coerce them in different ways, psychologically. And he'd use, various narcissistic tendencies of, loops and control to, push a narrative and then get you to find out what you're thinking, and then circle back around again on you and get something from you. It was really interesting. But he was a great storyteller, and, a lot of the leaders that we choose today are very narcissistic, polarizing people. It's because they're so black and white in their speech. They don't leave, an open-endedness there. It's easy to follow them because they're so clear in their directive, and they can take a ton of beatings because they forget because they're so obsessed with themselves. And Shawn was very much like this. He'd call himself a Labrador. Like, he would just come back like a puppy and forget all what happened. Well, that's a narcissistic trait, a severe narcissistic trait. But Shawn started down this path of seeing what I would be willing to endure with his crudeness and his humor and his sexual references, and then he incorporated me in environments when I traveled with him into his nakedness, and to him it was just another thing that guys did, but he'd be naked all the time. Like, if I was sharing a room with him, the second he got back to the room, he'd be naked, and he was touching himself all the time. And I believe on a handful of occasions, he pleased himself when I was in the room with him. Lights on, lights off. He's taking showers, walking back and forth, and answering the door naked, and calling me over to his room naked. And I just so disheartened by it. I felt like it's like this childish thing of like, grow up, but I felt like it was a thorn in my flesh too, because I'm like, I have this mission, this vision of what I want to do with God, and I'm willing to endure this thing. If this is my obstacle, I can endure it. Like, I'll just find a way to distance myself and brush it off, push it off, tell him no, and I did, and I found a way to distance myself, and to some extent, I asked for a separate room when we traveled, and I demanded it instead of like, having, like, it's okay with the budget. I really demanded it, and excuse me, didn't stop his personality and what he was doing, but I tried to stay safe in the middle of it. Obviously it got really weird. Shawn, insistently invited me to, go to Korean spas with him. He invited me to go out with him in the evenings. I said no to the evening stuff. I was married at the time. I met somebody at Bethel, passed all the tests, got 100 on all the pre-marriage stuff, and went through Danny's classes, and scored all that. And, they were there with me in Studio City, and I said no to all that stuff because of my family. But he asked me 12 times to go to the Korean spa, so I finally said yes to that. I'd never been to a Korean spa. I didn't know what it was, but I enjoy a good shoulder massage, so I thought, go get a back massage or something. And I didn't know that it was a naked spa, and you get butt naked, and then what he ordered for both of us was like a couple's like body scrub, where you get totally naked, you lay down on your back and your belly, and you get scrubbed in front of the other person. And so I'm laying next to him, a couple feet away. I'm on my back, and some Korean guy's scrubbing me naked while Shawn's there, completely visible with exposed, and I'm exposed. I'm in this room naked, and with the lights on and everything, and I, it was so painful emotionally. I knew, like, I've been through painful experiences. I wrestled, I played football, I dislocated my shoulders, had plastic surgery, I've been bit by a Rottweiler, reconstructive surgery. Like, I've been through painful experiences, but this is so emotionally painful to be here, because I'm arrested emotionally in this moment, and because my potential future is in jeopardy if I say anything, and if I push back, and if I bark. And I feel like Shawn did this in a way so we could have a shared negative experience, so he could have something over me. And he did that on a continual basis, because you feel the shame, you feel the guilt, you feel the wrongness, and you want to bury it. You don't want to bring it up. You've got God is available and all these other things, and if you blow it up by revealing, he did this to me, then your whole future with what you dreamed and what you hoped is gone. And there's such a power dynamic. I didn't feel like I had free choice ultimately to walk. I had to pay for my family, my car, my food. I was the breadwinner, and so I endured laying there, getting scrubbed in front of my boss, supposed to be my spiritual leader as well, and then walking around naked at this Korean spa, trying to cover myself up. And I never went back. After that I left, and I really truly distanced myself from Shawn in those personal settings. Obviously I worked with him a lot. It was very traumatic, but I went to lunch one day, and my ex-wife at the time said, she'd been cheating on me. She was having an affair with another woman. If I wasn't open to an open marriage, she wanted a divorce. And I said, I value myself too much. I care too much about myself. And so, I delivered the divorce papers. She'd been cheating for a while, and I left. And I left, with the dog. And Shawn was gracious, and he let me stay in his pool house suite, the studios. It's not suite, on the floor. And so I stayed there for a week. And during that time, he invited me, to have a drink and smoke a cigar in the evenings to relax. And I have to admit that was helpful during a really, painful time. And where you feel like your heart, is ripped out of your chest and betrayed, and Shawn said, you should go home and masturbate. You should go home and please yourself. And he would tell me that, and I felt like that was so strange. It's such a weird thing to tell somebody who's going through betrayal. But that's the kind of person that he is, But, the redemptive side of that is during the same week that happened to me, I met 3 people, including Steve and Jenny Maddox, and they were absolutely incredible. Steve said to me, unknowingly, he said to me that, he understood exactly what I went through, and that I was going to make it through. And because I couldn't see, a moment in my future, felt like my heart was ripped out. You feel like your peripheral, world is over, and you're so numb by the pain, And he told me that, and I've been best friends with Steve and Jenny since, and they've been incredible. And 2 other individuals came up to me that week and said the same thing, and I felt like it's just a blessing from God. And I listened to Dr. Joe Beam, Marriage Helper, his e-course on repeat, and it was so helpful, so wonderful. It was absolutely incredible to learn about limerence and learn about the whole process, and it helped me a lot, healed my heart. And I just listened to worship, and I just relied on my faith in God. And God was faithful. It was beautiful. God was there present in the middle of it. And I felt, there's so much pain, and you wonder these questions. The trauma, why am I experiencing all this pain? Why didn't God do something? Why didn't he say something? God, where were you? And I asked God, in an invitation sense, I said, where were you? And he said, you want to know where I was? And I heard inaudible voice. I'm driving to work. And I heard Jesus tell me the date and the time that my ex-wife had betrayed Jesus, and the actions that she did, and how painful it was for Jesus, and how it hurt him and it broke him. And he said, I'm the most relatable person in your life. And all the questions that I had, the questions that I didn't have, were answered in that. And I feel like Jesus was the most relatable person in my life. And then after that moment, after I got that, it was like a deposit. My capacity increased by 75%, 100%, if not more. It was just incredible. My capacity for life, for projects, for vision, and my heart was healed, and I was able to love again, in the future, and found my wonderful wife, Allie, and Shawn actually officiated our wedding, and all the people at Bolz went to our wedding, and I've been married to my wife, Allie, for 8 years now, or 7 or 8 years, 7 years. Been together for 8, married 7. I have a wonderful daughter. Her name's Aurora, and I was able to love again, and it was beautiful. But in the middle of that time at Bolz, I was growing things. I was working really hard, building out the ministry as much as I could. And I'd set up, things like building out the products, and I get a percentage of product sales, and then building out the partnerships, I get a percentage of that. And then as I grew it so fast, with different things. I ended up getting paid a good bit of money from just the commissions and stuff, and they transitioned me to salary because I was going to get paid more than they wanted to pay me, and they needed more time for me because they didn't want to pay me overtime. So I did that. I transitioned. I was willing to do that because I felt like I could have opportunities if I was more agreeable, then I'd have more opportunities. They always promised the world, but I never got the reward there. So we brought in help. I built out everything. Built out successful partnerships. I brought up the revenues on the courses. I wrote all the courses. Mostly, I think 90% of the courses. I wrote 70 to 80% of Shawn's books, if not more. All the workbooks. I wrote all the content. He paid me separate for 2 or 3 of the books, but a lot of the other ones I did just as my normal employment. I wrote them on the side. I just wanted the ministry to grow. I wanted God's message to grow. I wanted to help people. And so if you read one of Shawn's books, you read my work. And I've written 47 books at this point to date. And I've helped a lot of people with theology and writing books for people. I've enjoyed tremendously. But so we brought in help, we brought in assistance, and we brought in other people who worked in different departments, and we hired somebody that came down that was recommended, worked with other people for their assistant roles, itinerant roles, and I was open for any help, but I was pretty driven at this point. Like, I didn't want to do the personal stuff, so I always said no to that, but I was pretty driven with just trying to stay productive. And the internal joke was that Jeremy's the dad, and he's trying to he's in charge of all of us, and largely I was in charge of everybody, and Shawn managed his own schedule, but I was in charge of the directives within the schedule, and I would do the forecasting and the I do the financial, forecasting, and then, with some help, and I would do the product development, and I'd do the rollout and the yearly plans of execution, and the world travel events, and the tours and the events, like all of it. So I needed, someone else to help Shawn with his stuff on the personal level, and so we brought in somebody on the personal level. And this assistant uh, didn't really have as good of a work ethic. They came in and they loved spending time with Shawn and Cherie, and enjoyed the evenings and the weekends and the free time. They enjoyed the travel, and you could tell they really enjoyed it. Especially enjoyed their time with Cherie. They'd always laugh and have fun, but when it came to work, it was a little harder. It was a little bit more of a riff, because I wanted people to work on time. I wanted to put in good work, and so I was a little bit more firm on my boundaries there. So there was some contention there, and it seemed like whether it was work ethic or different things that were happening, I didn't really know. There was kind of a boiling over point, and you could tell the temperature was rising with this individual. And then there was this blowout moment, I don't know, year and a half or so, where we had a meeting, and Shawn and this individual and myself, they had a little bit of a blowout, really angry at me. It felt like they kind of wanted my job, but didn't really understand it because they couldn't manage what I was doing, couldn't manage half what I was doing. They just kept saying, Jeremy's only here because he's making you money, and they'd say stuff like that. And, but, this individual, we caught him several times, at the beach when he's supposed to be working, other things. So it was like questionable behavior. Nevertheless, he took his computers home and tried to wipe them clean, the Hillary Clinton thing, smash them with the hammers and stuff without the smashing. And, he transferred a bunch of stuff to himself personally, and took a bunch of, Bolz Ministries credit card points and booked himself a bunch of stuff, including hotel rooms. And, he left in a fiery furnace in the middle of the night after this blow up in the meeting. I didn't really understand the meeting. I didn't understand why he was mad. But in hindsight, I think he was mad at Shawn. But it was being directed at me, and I was used to that in terms of the direction at me. Like I was the buffer for the ministry. Like I stood in the middle of any feedback that came to the ministry for Shawn. I buffered, correspondence and problems, and I dealt with that stuff. And if it was an issue, I'd raise it. But if not, I would just deal with it myself, including the employees. So I often became the villain in that sense, and I was okay with that. That was my job to be the buffer. Excuse me. And so he left in the middle of the night. I found out the next morning because I reversed, a lot of the stuff he deleted on his laptops, and clawed back the spent, Bolz Ministries credit card points, and canceled the hotels that he bought from the points, and really weird behavior. But he was very mad. And Shawn started to villainize him quickly, just as he had villainized his past assistants as well. Just thought those were one-offs initially, because you're like, okay, maybe this will be fine, and they didn't work out. But turns out every assistant was villainized. So he started villainizing this assistant and said a bunch of stuff about him and all these personal things. And I did find some weird searches that the person made on their laptop, and questionable searches online, because all that stuff's tracked. And I didn't really think too much of it until the paper mail started coming in, and there was a lawsuit for this, and there was an unemployment lawsuit for this, and a bonus lawsuit for that, and then Danny and Chris from Bethel were knocking on the door, wanting to come down and find out what was going on with Shawn. There were some accusations made about some cheating words, and I guess at some point, I was not in these meetings, but at some point there was 20 pages or so of maybe 100 pages of copied and pasted things from online that were presented to some of the Bethel leadership about potential cheating words from Shawn. I have yet to see these lists, apart from maybe some of the few little snippets that have been posted on different videos online, YouTube. And basically, Chris and Danny kind of took charge of investigating these claims because, they had known Shawn for years at that point. I'm not sure exactly how many. And for a while, and Shawn would go up and speak at Bethel twice a year, and the books were sold in the bookstore and all that. They'd meet at conferences and stuff. They were, similar itinerant ministries peers, they were peers. And so they were coming down. And the person went to Chris and Danny, or I guess the information found their way to Chris and Danny, because that's kind of where they came from. Not necessarily because Bethel had any leadership over Shawn. They were just connected and affiliate in that way because Shawn went there twice a year. And so Chris and Danny are investigating these things, and they came down, and then, we all had to leave the office. Shawn didn't want us to know about any of it. He didn't want us to, find out exactly what was going on, because he wanted to keep the narrative, because Shawn's number one thing was his reputation management. So, when Danny and Chris were down there, he would spin it, and he would start making them evil villains. They became evil villains overnight. And I'm like, I don't believe what you're saying, because I experienced, obviously Danny and Chris can, they can grab onto a bone and hang on to it, if they want. They've got thick skin. They're tough people. They're if they want to go after something and they're pushing for something, then they're willing to fight for it, and they're not afraid of confrontation. That's for sure. I've seen them confront a few people on the peripheral, and they challenged Shawn. They challenged him on the words. I'm not sure if any of the alleged sexual allegations came out. Perhaps it did. I'm not sure if it did. But they definitely challenged him on the word stuff, perhaps on some of the inappropriate messages that were shared, and to curb that, kind of immature behavior, immature lifestyle, And so I think that those things were addressed. I doubt whether or not the sexual stuff was fully explored and shared, because I think it would have escalated more. But at this point, it was based on the words given in Shawn's ministry, and you've got years and years and years of positive impact from Shawn's words. And then now you've got somebody who's coming from the inside circle with a list from potentially a third party, not the person who was the assistant, who's presenting these words, and they're saying that Shawn's a cheater. And so, Chris and Danny were willing to explore it, along with whoever else was involved in the leadership team. But Chris and Danny, I think, came down twice, if I'm not mistaken. And Shawn denied the allegations, whatever personal allegations were said against him. Perhaps it was some of the inappropriate behavior and some of the sexual stuff. Not sure. And he definitely denied the cheating of the words. And Chris was doing everything he can to kind of work with Shawn to either get him to repent, get him to go through a process. So was Danny, and try to figure it out. Like, let's sort this out. And Shawn was unwilling, and so Chris and Danny were like, let's meet with your board, Shawn's board. And Shawn's board is non-existent, even though you can look up Shawn's board from Love Coalition, from the IRS forms that are publicly accessible. You can see the names. Shawn's boards were non-existent. The people that were on Shawn's boards were people that were friends of Shawn's. They would either be there for fun and for pleasure for Shawn, where they'd go to Vegas and do their board meetings over a craps table consistently, or they would be the money behind the ministry, and he would just ask them for money and they would give money. Those are the two people that Shawn invited on his board, the two kinds of people. But they were non-existent. Shawn and Sheree had all control over their board. They didn't want anyone else to have any say over their lives. They built this parachurch, which is a specific kind of 501c3, to be independent intentionally, apart from the church that he had set up and he handed over. So there was no one else to check in with. The phone calls, whether they happened or not, were empty because nobody was in charge of Shawn. He'd made sure of that. And so his board, was swept under the rug because they don't want to deal with this stuff. They never signed up for that. And their board was reestablished with only one member, the last person that's supporting Shawn currently. In terms of a ministerial sense, it's easy for you to look that up. And, they would be the hedge of protection and covering in the midst of all of it and act as a mediator. But in terms of who you could reach out to help sway the decision making of Shawn and help make things better, there was no one else. Shawn had distanced himself from the other ministries. He'd set himself apart. He'd, done his own personal narration and, narrative control for other people as much as he possibly could, to help kind of, manage impressions. But he realized that he just needed to pivot from Bethel, and ultimately he said no to Chris. Chris had set up something where maybe Shawn could come in and prophesy and pray over some people and prove that he was gifted, and they'd be on with it, right? Prove the gift, because the gifts of God are irrevocable. And, your character is a different story, but the gifts are irrevocable. And Shawn denied doing that. He didn't want to do it. He didn't want to participate. I know he didn't. His ego was too big to submit to anybody or anything. So he said no, and that he'd set stuff up. He'd been his own master forever. Just kind of like Mike Bickle, I guess. So ideally, a little bit of a stalemate there. Bethel goes back and tries to make a decision on what to do, and there's no conclusion. What's the conclusion? Shawn denies everything, and you got potentially a victim that's, could be questionable. It's hard to know. Now, whether or not they heard testimony, evidence, or testimony from previous victims of Shawn's, I'm not sure. Perhaps, maybe they didn't. This is the first time they're hearing from me. I have yet to share my story to Chris or Danny or Bill or any of those guys publicly. I've only shared it on a few occasions to a few individuals, including an affidavit that I did. So Bethel's largely undetermined on what to do. But in order to feel safe, I think the decision was made internally to distance themselves from Shawn because he's not cooperating. Can't prove anything. They just got a bunch of copy and pasted stuff from Facebook and, one person. And then, Chris goes through his thing. He reaches out a bunch, and he really essentially shuts all the Bethel doors on Shawn, turns off the spigot. And Shawn gets disinvited to the conferences, no more Bethel people on the podcast and the TV shows, and no more products being sold in the store, and, a lot of doors closed. And, at that point, the transition was from Glendale, where Shawn and Sheree were making good money, but it was growing, and we were paying $3,000 a month in rent, to they bought a big house in Studio City, and they were paying, close to $25,000 a month in rent. Month in mortgage. And then they were paying themselves on top of it, so the money was flying out the window, literally. And I was making them a lot of money, selling, $1 million of courses and tremendous amount of books, events, and everything. And they'd get to the point every year where they'd say, so sorry we ran out of money. We wanted to bless you. We couldn't bless you. Hopefully we can do it next year if things are better. Meanwhile, they paid themselves over $1 million, or $800,000 or $1.2 million. And they're looking at me like, so sorry, we can't, we promise we'll make you, we'll make it up to you next year or whatever. So I just stayed idle at the exact same pay several years. And I was okay with that because I felt like the promise still lingered. But, one year they ended up giving me a gift card for $100 when they were giving their contractors, bigger bonuses. And that was after the contention of, I pushed back on the finances. Cherie was largely in charge of the finances, and she just, loved spending money, and she was spending sometimes $25,000 a week on her stuff, house and everything else, and they'd spend $100,000 and $200,000 on eating out, Uber Eats every year, if not more. They'd go on personal trips, with the ministry. They'd find every way to spend money through the ministry without actually taking it as income, because they broke the rules 1 or 2 years where they paid themselves too much. And essentially, they just got money hungry. So they were, bleeding money left and right, even though we were making so much money as a ministry, and it was a personal piggy bank for them. They'd write contracts to companies and move money, and and it was just a big game. And I was, trying to let them be responsible, but at some point, it started to not only inhibit my growth, but inhibit the growth of the ministry, inhibit the growth of what we could do. It wasn't just, a temporary personal consumption. It was just an abundant personal consumption. And, they ended up doing a multi-million-dollar rehab on their house. And they got the ministry to pay for all of it, but then they took the money personally, as income. And one time I said to Cherie, because it was really contentious, she's telling me I'm spending too much on, products and development and advertising, even though we had agreed budgets and stuff, because they didn't have any money. And she was spending double the amount on Amazon packages, And I said, what do you do all day? And at that moment, that was when she started really, truly hating me. She was technically the CFO, but she only showed up to get the checks. She only showed up and said, where's the checks? Tell me the numbers and where's the checks? And she walked over one time a week basically for the checks, and she'd show up for the morning meetings and whatever and say hi. But, I never really understood their personalities, but, the two met, I think in Vegas. Cherie was like some waitress at a casino or a bar, and they went to ICLB or met there or something, but she was proud about stealing packages at other people's weddings. Like, that was a fun thing she used to do, I guess. And I always felt like that was so weird. And Shawn, just kind of let Cherie do whatever she wanted, with the money. And it got really contentious with that. After I said, what do you do all day? And she started, really truly hating me. So we distanced our work relationship, and I was just trying to put my head down and work. And at that point, I think I overstayed my welcome, and I was beginning to be villainized. I was the hero before. I did everything for them, and I made everything happen for them. It was amazing. And then now I'm the ultimate villain, And so the little things were being blown out, and then, then come, them selling their house. They sold their house to Black Lives Matter, one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, and they, made more than it was worth. Got over asking price on that, and he tried to hide it from us in terms of him selling his house to Black Lives Matter, but he did. And it's going to be in a documentary, I'm sure. It already is. I think Candace Owens went there once, filmed there, but they couldn't afford it anymore because, the streams of income were drying up a little bit. It was getting harder. So Shawn, turned his leeching behavior towards Matt Crouch to see if he could get something from him. And so he worked out a TV show over there. And, it was at that time when, Bill went to, TBN. Bill has been on TBN a few times. And if TBN wants to move the needle, they bring Bill in if they can. They'll convince him to come down and do a show. And, Bill's ratings are much more than everyone else's. And they really wanted to get Shawn's stuff off the ground if they could. So they used his book and they tried to see if they could leverage it to make some money. It's a big money when you move books through the networks. And I think they had scheduled Shawn, and then they scheduled Bill, overlapping. I'm not sure if they actually informed them collectively, or if they just, it was a coincidence that they were there at the same time, asked them to participate. I'm not sure. I didn't personally go, but I was in LA. And Bill endorsed the book that I think he wrote the forward and endorsement for, book that he said he loved, and it's a great book. Talks about the heart of God and what God could do in an individual. And then he endorsed Shawn, at that point. And I know a lot of people are scrutinizing that exchange. Bill knew all these things and still endorsed him. And, I'm trying to put myself in if I was in the chair across from them. At that point in time, Bill had only personally received positive experiences with Shawn, to my knowledge. And, intimate, words about Bill's father and where Bill's father lived and how to get there and what God was saying about their family and the movement. And he'd only had positive experiences with a friend that came, for decades, I guess. Many, many years, and he cherished the words, he cherished the prophetic words. And, he would pray over them and ruminate over them and read them. And he wholeheartedly believed in the book that he endorsed, Translating God. And he endorsed Shawn, he said, the person that you live by. And it's like, well, after the accusations, how could you endorse something like that? In a world that they're in, they would receive accusations every single week from somebody. Literally, Shawn would every single week. And I know Bill and Chris and Danny do. Every single week, they receive accusations from people. Every single week. And, largely the majority of it is unsubstantiated. It's not true. It doesn't come about. But that's the case, Bill is speaking from his heart, shared his heart. And it doesn't look good, obviously, when we're like, why would you endorse someone who's so evil? And you're like, what did he actually know? His experience with Shawn was good, maybe, at that point. And he definitely didn't know my story, so he didn't know my story. And then, Shawn and Tree go and moved to Santa Clarita and hide up there, and they created distance there, and trying to afford living in LA, and they weren't living in LA anymore. And then eventually, the accusations started piling up against me. I got an email one day of him being accused of a million things. I guess a former friend of Shawn's was borrowing money from a lot of people, including myself, and wasn't giving it back. And I got piled in, with all the accusations. And I said, I'm innocent. This has nothing to do with me. But they took it as an opportunity because they were looking for an out, So they, they pursued it, and put pressure on me, and had me meet with their lawyers. And I ended up getting a couple lawsuits against me, and I had them dropped. They were dropped. I'm 3-0 in terms of the lawsuits. And, it was a year and a half or more of my life and money spent defending myself. But, the truth came out. And, they were just looking for a way to get rid of me. So I quit, but Shawn Shree said that, they fired me. And they told their staff not to talk to me. They they shut down any relationships that I had in the exterior. I had other contracts with a job with business with my wife, and they made sure every one of those contracts went away in 1 month. They called up people and they tried to harm me financially. They tried to shut me down and made sure I wasn't able to work with anybody that I knew, which was very hard because I devoted so much time and energy and selflessly and working for very little and sometimes working for nothing to help and serve them, and they were so willing to burn every bridge because I knew too much. I knew that they were the relationship had turned. They'd shown their cards and they wanted me out because I wasn't willing to be controlled anymore. But the people that stayed were, unfortunately, they were followers. And they didn't really think for themselves, but they were just willing to take whatever Shawn said because that was their last resort, So I left. And 1 week after leaving, I had received a phone call from an individual that was previously abused by Shawn. And this was many years before. It wasn't the same assistant, it was someone else. And they told me their story, and it was so much like mine, but worse, way worse. And I think they waited until after I was done working with Shawn because they didn't want to harm my job, or maybe it was just coincidence in terms of timing. But Johnny Inlow reached out and said someone wants to talk to you, and I took the call, and they shared with me their story, and it was so sad because I heard there were other people that he had harmed, many others, and I had no idea. But I wasn't surprised as well, because the behaviors, are consistent. You can see the consistent thread of narcissistic tendencies that started in Kansas City. Shawn bragged about going to naked hot tub parties in Kansas City, and the leadership, not saying everybody, but I stayed away from IHOP because the eschatology was garbage, absolutely terrible. I stayed away from there. The worship music had bad eschatology in it, even though some of it was good. And the teaching had, 50% bad eschatology, terrible. And so I just stayed away from it altogether. I think I went to the coffee shop twice, and my mom made me go to one of the youth things at one point. But largely stayed away from Kansas City, even though Mike was a tremendous speaker, very gifted in speaking. Same thing with Shawn, similar gifting there, but very manipulative. And so I saw these patterns, it was the same pattern, and it's easy to see now in hindsight. But I largely left and had to kind of pick up the pieces for a little bit, because my entire world, they told the staff never to talk to me, don't speak to him, and that's the way you do it. You control the narrative, you isolate people, you don't let them speak, and you separate them. That's how he kept his victims separated, did the same thing with all of them. And after that, I ended up meeting with a clergy abuse victim advocate, and I shared my story in an affidavit, my whole story, and I shared, I knew there was many others included, and it's coming out hopefully in a report at some point in the future that will provide, clarity and direction in actionable items, hopefully. And I wrote a book for somebody on advocacy, 90,000 words. I hope it comes out soon. ghost wrote that. And I started a legal services nonprofit with Caleb Aponte, and it's CARE. Caleb's absolutely incredible and so familiar with this world of abuse. He's a prosecutor and wonderful man. And I met a lot of helpful people, afterwards. But I largely I see Shawn for who he is, and it's a mixed bag with me. It's not black and white, because there's good in there too, but there's also, the terrible evil as well. And same thing with Bob Hartley, like for instance with Shawn, I wrote 70-80% of his books. What do? I burn them all, I contributed my heart and soul to those things, and part of the ministry, but I realized that the gifts and callings of God are separate from the character of an individual, and there's individuals that will do it really well. I think Pastor Bill is one of the best. He prioritizes character in addition to the gifting equally, if not more. And there's others that do it poorly. And you don't find out until later, because you're wooed by the gift, and then you show up and you get to know the person, and then they start to reveal themselves. And then you're kind of trapped at that point sometimes. And but I still love the Lord, and I went on to write more books, and I'm trying to help people in different ways through launching their lives and helping them share their stories, and with the victims, for them to not be permanent victims, but for them to be healed victims and then transition into being healed, because today we have online advocates. A lot of the people share their stories are married to bitterness. They're married to resentment. They show up and they bleed on camera. They're not healed, and they're tenacious in their bitterness, and they're tenacious in their resentment. And even though they were once victim, they choose not to be healed, because at some point somewhere, we all have a measure of responsibility that we can accept in our situation, whether it was during or afterwards. And I understand the measure of my involvement, and I choose today, my involvement today is to, pursue the redemptive paths forward rather than be stuck in bitterness, because I've seen people be stuck for 20 years, with one event of trauma, and they're unable to move forward, they're unable to heal, because it's everyone else's fault, not theirs. Everyone else failed them. It's like the Moses situation where, Moses, you lead, you do it all for us. And they're blaming Moses for the golden calf that they created, These situations are like car accidents where there's someone with a bad driving, they're a drunk driver, and they run into you. And then the fire department and the police show up, and then we blame the fire department and the police for helping wrongly, even though the person to blame is the drunk driver. And so blame needs to fall squarely on the shoulders of Shawn. And if we're going to extend blame, let's extend blame to his best friends, to the people that actually know him and that desire to spend time with him on a regular basis when they can. And that's Shawn Foyt. As much as he'd like to distance himself, the slimy individual, he should be asked about Shawn's involvement, his involvement with Shawn through the years. And Shawn Smith and Krista Smith, we should be questioning them about why they're best friends with Shawn and Cherie, and what their involvement is, and what they know and what they don't know. We should ask Lauren Lancaster and her husband what their involvement is, what they know and what they don't know. We should ask the people that are supporting him financially what their involvement is and what they know and what they don't know. Not some side ministry that gets visited on a regular basis a couple times a year, that everybody looks up to, that has no accountability structure with Shawn. What about Jennifer and Hona Toledo, who are Shawn and Cherie's lifelong best friends in LA? Why aren't we asking them what they know and what they don't know and what kind of accountability they can bring? What about Samuel Robinson and Jeremy Nelson? And there's so many others. Why don't we ask them questions about Shawn's accountability, what they know and what they don't know, and what they're willing to participate in and help out with, rather than shooting the help. So many of us want a relationship like the one that Israel had with Moses, where there's one leader and we get to blame him for everything. But in the New Testament, we have personal responsibility for our lives. And you're supposed to test all words. That's why every prophetic word's not going to be accurate. That's why you're supposed to test them. If somebody gives you a prophetic word about your spouse, you don't like it, throw it away. I don't blame Bethel for my failed marriage. Are you kidding me? I don't blame Bethel for losing money because I invested poorly. I've received thousands of prophetic words. And where does it start and where does it stop? I'm not saying you can't be victimized by these things. Of course you can. But where do you lay the blame? At some point, somewhere, you got to accept the responsibility for your life. And hold those relationally accountable if they've relationally failed you. And that's what we're doing today. I hope that Shawn receives the full weight of the relational accountability and consequences that he's due. And so does Cherie. I hope they get it. And I believe they are getting it. And I hope that the justice of God is served, and I hope it's shown. But I also hope that the heart of God is protected in this, and we're not foolishly attacking those that are helping. I'm sure I have much more to say, but at this point I'll pause. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate you guys, and thank you for letting me share my heart.